So, the director of field education, I thought I would come at this from that role. What we do is we place students, some of my students are sitting in the room that have just been placed for their ministries for next year. But every student in a ministerial degree at CTU has to do some time in ministry. And we scaffold around them site supervisors that accompany them in their work. Some of the site supervisors were here earlier. We also have them in theological reflection cohorts where they spend time doing some good reflection on the work that they're doing and how it's shifting and changing their own identity as a minister. And then they have me, because I'm just their advocate in everything that we do. Sounds a little Trinitarian intentionally. So I thought I would come at this scripture story and this symposium from this perspective of Jesus as a mentor to his students. Jesus as a mentor. And if we want to think of perhaps this graduation they've come back through, which has been a traumatic graduation, you know, when our students leave us, we kind of assume they're going to go off and do great things. And I'm thinking that's what Jesus might have had in his mind. And then he sees them fishing again. That's why I titled my thing, Why Are They Fishing Again? Just this assumption, like they're just, did they get it? Did they miss it? And Jarrett, you were talking about being a playwright. And I just wanted to say, John was a playwright. Right? His scripture has them in the dark. Who goes fishing in the dark? Except that John's trying to say they just didn't get it, right? That's my assumption there. So I want to look at this. What is it that Jesus was doing with them in this story that mirrors for us a theology of accompaniment? And I then want to come to a couple of my own thoughts to add at the end. So if we can imagine this scripture, which we already had a little bit of a take on it throughout the day, right? I love the fact that Jesus doesn't start by scolding them, that he starts by helping them see their blind sides, maybe cast the net on the other side of the boat, right? In our process for students getting their degree at CTU, they have to write during their practicum year a theology of ministry statement. Jarrett, just like your personal mission statement. And it changes over time, right? And then they get to their class in their graduation year, and they have to revisit that, and they have to rewrite it. And so one of the stories, one of the first years that I taught that class, one of the students said to me, Chrissy, you let me turn in a load of crap. The first time he wrote it, right? And that's part of this, like, yeah, write what you're feeling in this moment, and maybe by the time you're graduating, you can critique your own work, right? So Jesus doesn't start by scolding them. You don't start by saying you turned in a load of crap. You start by inviting them to dig a little deeper. Food is always helpful, right? Jesus is providing for them a meal. But I also really love the piece where he invites them to bring some of the fish they caught. Like, he's not just doing it for them. He's providing for them a little bit of an understanding that they bring something to the table. They have to have a little skin in the game here in order to do this Eucharistic understanding of how we spread the good news. So good mentors see what their students have as gifts and invite them to build on that. They meet them where they are. Now, one of the things that we don't get to see in the English translation, and I know theologians, biblical scholars will argue different ways of understanding this, but there's different ways of saying the word love. And in the original text, Jesus starts by saying, Peter, do you love me, using agape, which is a deeper, intimate love. And Peter responds by saying, yes, Lord, I love you, philia, which is a little more less intimate, right? And so you can see this like nuance there. We don't get that in English, we just get love. But in the original text, we get that. And Jesus says it again, using agape, and Peter responds using philia. And so in the third one, Jesus uses philia, and Peter responds using philia. And I see that as this notion of Jesus adjusting his own expectations and meeting Peter where he's at. And we have to do that with our students. And so many of you talked about educational settings in many different places today, right? Not just in theology schools, but all of us as teachers have to adjust our own pedagogy to meet the student where they are, to get them a little further down the line. You also are building on a thought of trust, right? Jesus is asking him to feed my sheep. And we see Pope Francis taking that even further, saying, smell like the sheep, right? And this is maybe an odd thing to do, but like when you think about smelling like the animal, it is not just a movement of solidarity, but it is a movement of being someone they can trust. You smell familiar to me, and so therefore I trust you enough to follow you. And so that effort of saying, I need to be with you enough so that you trust me is a critical thing. And then he's, talking about following me. He doesn't just leave them alone. He sends an advocate. There I am again. But that sense of the Spirit joining us in these moments. And the last piece is that he's talking about love. And are you willing to love? And that's where I'd like to go next. In terms of formation, I see 3 places at which I, as a teacher, try to work with my students in terms of what I'm trying to teach them. The first is proximity, and Father Orbitor spent a lot of time yesterday talking about the importance of proximity. And, it is interdependent and it's relational, and this proximity is moving towards places of encounter. And so it's always about trying to push our students a little out of their comfort zone, getting them into placements that expose them to stuff going on in the world so that they can begin to take the theology they're learning in the classrooms and put it into, make it matter for the people that they're accompanying, right? So proximity is the first place that we talk about pedagogy. And in those moments, I have scaffolded site supervisors to accompany them as well. And then there are the moments of reflection, right? These are the class that they have every week. They're doing theological reflection. They're unpacking the stuff that they're learning in their other classes and trying to make sense of it all. But this is like where you pointed out, Jarrett, the piece on Schreiter saying some of this stuff is divine, right? Like some of this stuff is human-made. I can put my students in places of proximity, and I can put them in rooms for theological reflection, but the stuff that goes on there has to be Spirit-driven. I like to say this is how we let the Spirit get a word in edgewise in these communal theological reflections. But I'm going to read a quote here. Jennifer Ayers says, tucked into theological and ecclesial exuberance is an imperative operational educational theory. Once the right fact or idea or insight has been transmitted, lives will be changed. Learning, however, is about far more than transmission of content. Likewise, it's more than a powerful experience. It is a dynamic relational process full of nuance and mystery. There's your favorite word. We've left it to mystery. But I think this is an important thing for us to understand, that we have to create and carve the spaces, but then also trust that the Spirit is moving in this, and the invitation is to move further. One of the things that I've been spending a bit of time on as I think about spiritual formation is this term orthocardia. We know orthodoxy, right thinking, right knowledge, and we know orthopraxis, right actions, but orthocardia is this notion of the heart, the right heart, and how it moves us from an interior forum where our spirituality is focused on our relationship with God, but it moves us to a forum in which we are thinking about the good of the whole. Cindy Lee, in her book, Our Unforming, De-Westernizing Spiritual Formation, notes that what's often missing in spiritual formation paradigms is the health of our collective soul, right? And even Pope Francis said, at some point, this is in Dilexi Noi, At some point, however, in our contemplation, we should likewise feel the urgent plea, comfort, comfort my people, right? And so all of this work that we're doing to scaffold around our students, ways and mentors, is not just to get them out of their comfort zones, but to get their hearts committed to the mission of being missionary disciples. Steve, you're sitting here, but to be people who are impacting change for the world around us, who are having something to say that allows us to not just think about our own spirituality and our own relationship and what that relationship of God is, but what I'd argue is if we're in relationship with God, it ought to be demanding something of us, because God is demanding something of us, and that something is justice. In that justice, I feel, comes about through orthocardia, which is this sense of love. Pope Leo, who is, of course, an alum of here, I had a lovely opportunity to interview the woman who was the field ed director when he was here. So I was doing an article. I got to interview her, and she talked about his placement at St. Victor's Parish, and at the time when they were there, the pastor of St. Victor's was Father Leo Mann, which is a giant in the Chicago church. So there's a side of me that I wrote in that article that I wonder if that also has something to do with his selection of Leo. But there's this great quote that Sister Therese Del Genio told me. When she started there, he pulled the whole team into the room and he said, "We are not going to do anything for a year." This is Leo Mann, the pastor of the parish. And she says, us 5 sisters, we about fell on the floor. And he said, "We're going to divide the parish into 15 pieces, and each of you are going to have one section of the parish. And you are going to go and meet the people and get to know what it is they need, and then we'll do what they need to do," right? So he was clearly working out of his time in Panama and his work with base ecclesial ministers. And so I know part of that had something to do with Leo's formation. And one of the quotes that she said, that Leo Mann had said, is, "If you don't fall in love with the people, get out of the business," right? And Pope Leo seems to repeat that during his address last year to the Jubilee World of Education, where he says sharing knowledge is not enough for teaching. Love is needed. Only then will knowledge be beneficial to those who receive it in itself, and above all, for the charity it conveys. Teaching should never be separated from love. And St. Oscar Romero noted in 1979, "A civilization of love that did not demand justice of people would not be a true civilization. True love begins by demanding what is just." And so orthocardia moves us with authenticity to take up the work of charity and justice. Love, I have come to believe, is the most bold and faithful way of forming leaders who work for justice. So Jesus' 3-part question to Peter symbolizes an invitation not only to love God, but to allow that love to change our hearts and form us into people who feed others, people who seek justice, reconciliation, and mercy. In that moment, Jesus leads with love, but accomplishes reconciliation and mercy as well. And I believe that is the task at hand. Can we, in all of our frustrations, also find ways to lead into reconciliation with love, in hope, in how we teach, and also how we engage as witnesses for a world longing for hope?